What if everything you were taught about human history was just a fragment of a much larger story? What if the origins of civilization are not where you think they are? What if the most important chapter of human history has been deliberately buried, flattened, and erased from the pages of your textbooks? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the truth that archaeologists, geneticists, and historians have been uncovering for decades. And today, we are going to pull back the curtain on one of the greatest untold stories of all time. The story of Black life across human history. A story that spans over 300,000 years. A story that predates every empire, every religion, and every written record you have ever encountered. A story that will fundamentally change the way you see the world, your place in it, and what it means to be human. Are you ready to face the truth that has been hidden in plain sight? Because this is not a story about victimhood. This is a story about resilience, innovation, power, and the indomitable human spirit. This is the story that nobody told you in school. Let's start with a harsh reality. Most of what gets called history was actually written by the victors. They had a stake in how the story ended. Conquerors wrote about conquered kingdoms, and slavers wrote about enslaved people. They controlled the narrative. They decided what was remembered and what was conveniently forgotten. This doesn't mean those records are worthless, but it does mean that part of the truth has been left out. A significant part. When we talk about Black life across history, we are looking at a record shaped by people with motives to hide the truth, to minimize it, to flatten it into something palatable. For those who held power, understanding that is the first genuinely necessary step, because once you understand that the history you have been taught is incomplete, you can begin the process of rediscovering what was lost. The real picture comes from archaeology and oral tradition and rapidly advancing modern research. It is far richer and older than we think, far more complex and far more inspiring. It's a story filled with tragedy, but also triumph, with suffering, but also extraordinary resilience, with oppression, but also relentless resistance. Let's start at the true beginning of humanity, Africa. Africa is where anatomically modern humans first evolved. This is not a belief. This is not a theory. This is a scientific fact. Every person alive on Earth today, no matter where you come from or what you look like, no matter your skin color, your ethnicity, or your nationality, traces their ancestry back to Africa. Every single one of us, every human being on this planet, shares a common origin, and that origin is Africa. This changes everything. It means Black history is not a small chapter inserted into a broader story. It is the origin, the foundation, the very beginning of the entire human story. Every civilization that followed descends from populations on this continent. Every culture, every language, every technological innovation, all of it can be traced back to the ingenuity of African peoples. This is not just inspirational framing. This is the current scientific consensus, supported by genetics and archaeology and paleoanthropology. For most of the past 100,000 years, African societies existed in an almost incomprehensible range of forms. They were not primitive. They were not backward. They were advanced, sophisticated, and deeply connected to their environments. Hunter-gatherer communities like the San people of southern Africa maintained one of the oldest continuous ways of life on Earth. They adapted perfectly to their environments, with rich knowledge systems and spiritual traditions developed across tens of thousands of years. They understood the natural world in ways that modern scientists are only beginning to appreciate. Agricultural communities across the Sahel and Great Lakes regions developed complex systems of land management. They cultivated crops, domesticated animals, and built permanent settlements. They created societies with rules, customs, and governance structures. And from roughly 3,000 years ago onward, large, powerful, and sophisticated states emerged. They flourished across the continent. These were not isolated villages. These were empires, with cities, armies, and bureaucracies, with kings, priests, and scholars. their scale and achievements truly astonished European visitors when they finally made contact. Visitors who had been told that Africa was a dark continent. Visitors who arrived expecting to find savagery. Instead, they found grandeur. Instead, they found magnificent cities and prosperous kingdoms. But these achievements are still overlooked in textbooks, still minimized, still pushed to the margins of world history. This is where the historical record becomes clearest. The kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan, grew powerful enough to conquer Egypt. They did not just trade with Egypt, they conquered Egypt. They produced a dynasty of pharaohs of Nubian origin, African kings who ruled over one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Their monuments still stand today. Their pyramids are older than many of the pyramids in Egypt itself. The Axumite kingdom in Ethiopia was one of the four great powers of the ancient world. Alongside Rome, Persia, and China, they controlled trade routes on the Red Sea, connecting Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. They minted their own coins and adopted Christianity as a state religion in the 4th century. Centuries before most of Europe. Think about that. Christianity arrived in Africa long before it became the religion of Europe. Long before it was imposed on African peoples. Great Zimbabwe is a great stone city with massive, precisely constructed walls that required no mortar, walls that have stood for centuries without falling. It was built between the 11th and 15th centuries by the ancestors of the Shona people. It was the center of a powerful trading network, stretching across southern Africa to the coast, a network that connected African kingdoms to the rest of the world. The medieval West African empires deserve special attention. The Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire followed one another. They controlled the flow of gold and salt across the Sahara, generating enormous, unprecedented wealth, making their rulers among the most powerful figures in the known world. The Emperor of Mali, Mansa Musa, undertook his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. In 1324, his entourage numbered in the tens of thousands. They carried so much gold that it depressed gold prices across the Mediterranean. That event impacted the economy for more than a decade. His pilgrimage alone reshaped global markets. Imagine the power. Imagine the wealth. Timbuktu, the city within this empire, was one of the world's great centers of Islamic learning. It housed universities and vast libraries, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. These were not just religious texts. These were works of science, philosophy, and literature. Many of those manuscripts still survive today and are still being studied and translated. They represent a lost golden age, a golden age that the world has largely forgotten. This matters for a simple, powerful reason. When the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest, in the 15th century, the populations it targeted were not culturally or politically primitive. They were not helpless. They were not waiting for civilization to arrive. They had sophisticated societies with their own histories and traditions, with remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements. The violence of the slave trade was not a rescue mission. It was not a gift of civilization. It was systematic destruction on an almost incomprehensible scale of civilizations that had been developing for thousands of years. The numbers are genuinely hard to absorb. Somewhere between 10 and 12 million Africans survived the ocean crossing to arrive in the Americas. That number is staggering, but it is only part of the story. An unknown but substantial number died during capture, died on the march to coastal ports, or aboard the ships themselves. During the Middle Passage, many never made it. Their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic. Their stories were erased before they could even begin. This forced migration lasted roughly 400 years, from the late 1400s to the mid-1800s. 400 years. It was the largest forced movement of human beings in history. It severed communities, families, and languages. It tore apart social structures that had existed for centuries, leaving gaps that reshaped the demography of entire regions. The labor extracted from enslaved people in the Americas created agricultural surplus, that fueled the industrial development of Europe and North America: cotton, sugar, tobacco, gold, silver, all of it produced by enslaved people, all of it building the wealth of Western nations. The economic foundations of modernity were concretely built on this system. Modern capitalism was born in the blood and sweat of enslaved Africans. What is consistently underemphasized is how enslaved people actually lived. Not just the legal structure of slavery, but the internal social worlds. They built and maintained the communities they formed, the families they raised, the cultures they preserved, under conditions of extraordinary violence and deprivation, conditions designed to break them, conditions designed to strip them of their humanity, but they refused to be broken. Across the Americas, enslaved people preserved and adapted elements of African spiritual practice, music and language. They did not forget where they came from. They did not abandon their ancestors. They transformed their traditions to survive in a new world. They created something new, something powerful, something that would change the course of human culture forever. The musical traditions emerging from enslaved communities in the American South became the foundation for virtually every major American popular music genre. Blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, R&B, and hip-hop all trace their roots back there, all of them born from suffering, joy, resistance, and hope. A massive cultural legacy from a community denied basic human rights. They created something miraculous in the darkness, something that would outlast the system that tried to destroy them. Resistance to slavery was constant and varied. Acts of sabotage, flight, and self-liberation happened continuously. Slaves burned crops, poisoned masters, and ran away. They fought back in every way imaginable. Larger organized rebellions, like the Haitian Revolution, shook the world. A colony of enslaved people overthrew Napoleon's army, one of the most powerful military forces in history. They established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. In 1804, Haiti became a symbol of freedom, a symbol that terrified slaveholders. Across the Americas, slaveholding nations isolated and refused to recognize Haiti. They were afraid that Haiti's example would inspire other rebellions. France extracted the equivalent of tens of billions of dollars from them, demanding payment for the loss of their enslaved labor force. Haiti had to pay these sums until 1947. That crippled their development for over a century. The formal abolition of slavery opened a period of hope and also brought a violent backlash. During the Reconstruction era in the US, black people voted and ran for office. They held positions from local school boards to the US Senate. For the first time, African Americans experienced political power. They demonstrated their potential when given access to political rights. But this period was destroyed by violence. White supremacist campaigns rose up. They replaced it with a system of legal segregation. This system lasted for nearly a century. Enforced by terror, the Jim Crow era is often understood through its laws, but its cultural and social aspects are equally significant. African Americans built extraordinary institutions. Historically, black colleges educated generations of doctors and lawyers. When white institutions were legally or practically closed to them, black-owned newspapers like the Chicago Defender shaped public opinion. The Harlem Renaissance produced a concentrated flowering of artistic brilliance. They defined black American identity on their own terms, not through the distorting lens of white popular culture. The intellectual tradition of this period is profoundly important. Frederick Douglass in the 1840s wrote first-rate political philosophy. He engaged with constitutional interpretation and the logic of democracy. He was not just a former slave, he was a brilliant thinker. Ida B. Wells investigated and published on lynching. She combined facts with courage. In the face of real danger, she documented the violence and exposed it to the world. W.E.B. Du Bois developed the concept of double consciousness. It remains an enduring framework in American social thought. These were not minor figures. They were among the sharpest political and social minds of their era. They had a profound insight into power and social structure. The 20th century brought massive changes for black communities. In America, the civil rights movement is often told as a sentimental story. But the reality was far more complex. The movement was strategically sophisticated and organizationally disciplined. Thousands of ordinary people accepted the risks. They absorbed violence and retaliation. To participate, they achieved legislative victories through a combination of moral argument and economic pressure. And they used confrontational tactics deliberately to expose the violence of segregation. To the whole world, this was especially significant during the Cold War, when America's racial practices became a diplomatic liability. At the same time, Africa was undergoing decolonization. Only a handful of African nations were independent in 1945, but by 1970, there were dozens. Weakened European empires reluctantly released their colonies. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta developed sophisticated political philosophies. They debated African identity and modern state building. About economics and continental unity, South Africa's path was longer and more brutal. Apartheid was institutionalized in 1948. It was one of the most elaborately constructed systems of racial domination, maintaining white minority political control for nearly half a century through law and violence. The African National Congress was founded in 1912. They sustained organized resistance through decades of repression. Nelson Mandela was released in 1990 after 27 years in prison. He became South Africa's first black president. In 1994, it was one of the most significant political transitions of the 20th century. It happened without the widespread violence most observers expected. Contemporary black life carries the weight of this history, but people are not reducible to it. Diverse African nations are navigating colonial legacies. They are developing their own institutions and identities. Black communities worldwide are incredibly diverse. They share cultural heritage and political experiences. The global reach of African American cultural influence is undeniable. In music, film, sports, and fashion, it is one of the most remarkable instances of cultural influence emerging from a community that was once systematically excluded. What is lost when history is flattened is the humanity people built and created in every single period. Enslaved people maintained culture across generations. They were not just passive victims of historical forces. They made choices about what to preserve and how to maintain their dignity. Intellectuals and artists were not exceptions. They were the result of continuous collective effort. Communities that consistently produced extraordinary people. Look at the long history. Beyond familiar centers, there were black communities in medieval Europe. They were soldiers, scholars, and traders. The Moors were present in Spain for nearly 800 years. Their influence is still visible in Latin culture and language. There were significant African communities in Persia and India. They developed their own identities. In Southeast Asia, this global dispersion predates the slave trade by centuries. Black women had a specific experience. In history, they faced the unique vulnerability of sexual exploitation. This shaped families and communities in specific ways. Harriet Tubman made 19 missions to rescue enslaved people. Sojourner Truth fought for both women's rights and racial justice. They were not supporting figures in a male-dominated story. Mothers preserved culture across generations. That was a deliberate form of political resistance. Women like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer did the sustained organizing work the movement relied on, while men often received the spotlight. Recovering history means recovering women's stories. Art in this history is not just entertainment. It is genuine intellectual and political work. Blues, jazz, and hip-hop were born from specific communities. They were denied copyright and compensation for their work. Their music was appropriated and commercially exploited. But black artists continuously created new forms. Understanding this adds depth to the music itself. Religion also played a crucial role. African traditions were suppressed during the colonial period, but enslaved people created syncretic traditions. Voodoo in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba. They merged African spirituality with Catholicism. These were sophisticated adaptations, not compromises. They served as spiritual practice, cultural preservation, and encoded resistance. Black American Christianity is a distinct tradition. The Black Church was not just a religious organization. It was the center of community and political life. They developed a theology of liberation and dignity not imported from white Protestantism. It was born from the experience of suffering and resistance, and it gave the civil rights movement its moral language. So what was Black life like? Across history, it was ancient. Before it was anything else, it was powerful, prosperous, and scholarly. Before it was dispossessed, it resisted and created in every period. It produced world-class intellectual traditions, while being excluded from the institutions that recognized them, and it continues right up to today, across continents and cultures, as one of the longest and most global stories in human history. The full version of that story is still being recovered, still being pieced together from fragments and forgotten archives, and by any serious measure, it is one of the most important histories to know. Don't let the truth stay buried in old pages. Keep searching and keep learning, because history is not just about the past. It is about who we are and who we can become. If you want to explore more stories like this, please subscribe to the 5-Minute Mentor. We will search for the truth together. See you in the next video.